So 24 frames, many of you all know what that means. It's the industry standard for 1 second or 1 moment in a movie. 24 frames makes up that moment, thereabouts. I want to think about how we reframe this story, and in particular how this story may reframe our story. We've been looking at that. We've been looking at Bible stories, this idea of why is that in there? What about this story? There's something else going on here that's beneath the surface. And before we get into that, I need to kind of get you familiar with something which you may already know about, but let's see. Can you read that word, Shibboleth? So I'm going to count to 3, and we all pronounce it. You ready? 1, 2, 3. Most of you would survive. In the 11th century, there might be a few of you who would die at the river. There was a story in the book of Judges, and Judges, I'm going to forget now which chapter it is, but it's a story that takes place about the 11th century, 10th century BCE, where the Gileadites, the people of God, have been fighting against the Ephraimites and defeated the Ephraimites. However, they've scattered, and now they're in disguise. They're trying to get back across the Jordan River to their own home. So there's this wonderful sort of scheme, this little trick that the Gileadites conceived. Shibboleth is a word that has a number of sort of subtle meanings, a couple of subtle meanings, but it actually has no meaning. It's almost a play on words. So it's meant a lot of different things. The sheath on the outside of corn, the actual corn stalk. Some people use it to actually refer to a stream or a flow of water. But the whole point is that as the Ephraimites would come up to the river to get across, it reminded me of the scene why am I not thinking the Knights of the Round Table and the Monty Python and the Holy Grail? Thank you. Remind me of the guy standing at the bridge saying, "What's your favorite color?" Right? Shibboleth. Can you say the word Shibboleth? Well, unfortunately for a lot of the Ephraimites, for apparently 42,000 Ephraimites, they could not pronounce the word. They would pronounce it Sibboleth. They couldn't get the H sound and instantly were killed on the spot. So at the end of the text it says 42,000 were killed because of this. Now I'm thinking at about 20,000 surely somebody's passed the word back. It's not si. You'd think that would get back after a couple, 10, 15,000 people, but 40,000 people died. When you read the book of Judges, you read story upon story of the Israelites going to battle against different peoples around them. And they defeat, and their kingdom is restored. And then for 80, 90 years, there is Israelite peace, and God reigns. And then somebody else comes through. And you're apt to look at this, if you're like some people, and look at all these stories in the Judges and think, well, these stories are about how God always comes through in the end and kills off our enemies. Instead of looking at it as, no, this is how the people never quite get it. Because as soon as they remember the covenant, they forget the covenant because they think the covenant is all about power and possession. And what happens in the end is they lose it. And that's where Jesus is in our story today. 1,000 years later, same story, same verse, Jesus is confronting the shibboleth of the time. Now, purpose of a shibboleth, as you might have used it in your own work or your own experience, or maybe when you were in high school, there were certain cliques that had certain phrases or certain words or certain songs that they all listened to. But if you didn't listen to it, well, you weren't welcome, right? And so with the shibboleths are around us all the time. But in a sense, what's going on here for these people in this story is this sense of Mosaic law has become a shibboleth. It's become a way of defining who's in and who's out. But we have it in modern times as well, and we do it in very subtle ways. Who's successful and who's not. Who's handsome and attractive and who's not. Who's athletically healthy and who's not. who looks right and who doesn't. I mean, we do this all the time. I remember once being in a prayer group years and years and years ago, and I had already sort of moved away from my fundamentalist evangelical years in InterVarsity Fellowship and some other groups, and I remember being asked to pray in this group of people. Well, it was a Baptist church, and there were a number of my friends from the past that were there, and as I started offering this prayer to the holy presence of the Holy One, and I was speaking in sort of these mystical terms, I could feel this uneasiness starting to move around me. I could just sort of, I didn't open my eyes because I was afraid of what I'd see if people were looking at each other going like, what is he talking about? Who's this Holy One that he's mentioning? And it felt very uncomfortable, and I started to say, Father God, Jesus, we just pray. And we just look, and as I started to loosen it up and use that sort of cliche familiar language, I could almost feel a sigh in the group. Oh, as if they're saying, he's one of us. Shibboleths are part of our culture. They're part of our reality, right and left, all the time. And we do it blindly sometimes. And it's what's going on here in this story of stoners and swingers. You saw the play on words. I'm sorry it wasn't about the 60s. The thing that I want you to get with this picture is what's going on in the background. First of all, in the story, Jesus, if you read the text, well, you'd have to read it just before. Just before in chapter 7, Jesus and the disciples are celebrating with thousands of people in Jerusalem, and they're celebrating the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, it's important to know this because the Feast of Tabernacles is one of 8 major feasts that happen during the year, tabernacles. And the Feast of Tabernacles is one of the last feasts, basically, that happen in the year. It's a very important feast because it's a celebration of God's presence in the world, as well as an entreatment or a calling, a longing for God to bring water, to fertilize the land, essentially. It's an important time of celebration, but an important time of sacrifice and prayer, because life depended on life. Life depended on water. And so this Feast of Tabernacles is taking place, and thousands of people, it'd be sort of like a big tent festival. Thousands of people would be gathering in Jerusalem outside of the temple and outside the temple area in their tents, and they would be gathering for these lectures or these discussions with the Pharisees, or as it said in here, the experts, and they would be teaching. And what they would be teaching on is they would be teaching about the covenant, the covenant, if you remember the covenant that Noah experienced when God said, I promise not to destroy anymore, as we did in our first story, and now I'm going to be with you, and I'll leave the rainbow as a reminder of this covenant between us. Then Abraham, now your people will be an enormous people, and they'll exist to bless all the people of the world. Remember, blessed to be a blessing. Well, that's this covenant, which often, as I mentioned, gets screwed up because, well, we get greedy, our egos get in the way, we want to protect what we have, etc. And so the judges are talking about this covenant, but they're talking about water. They're talking about the importance of water. And if you go to chapter 17 and you read in there, in Judges chapter 17, I forget the actual verse, but it says, we long for our hope, O God, in you, that you would establish, let me see, I don't want to forget it. Yes. You would establish your living waters, and for all of those who turn from you, it would be as if their names were written in dust. They're using that. They're teaching that. They're teaching about water, how important water is. Everything's centered around that. Sacrifices. In fact, if you read the rest of the chapter, after this chapter 8, what Jesus does, he goes to the tabernacle, and at the end of all the ceremony, he says a very famous line. He says, I am the living water. I have living water to offer you. Right as they're pouring the water on the altar, Jesus says, I'm this living water. So this whole thing has been set up as this kind of confrontation with this shibboleth understanding, with this idea of in-groups and out-groups. And that's the moment at which the Pharisees have found a woman committing adultery. Now, first of all, back up. Thousands of people, lots of tents. They're drinking wine all week long. It's going to happen. Okay? Think about it. These are human beings. These are people, right? Not everybody. It's not an orgy, but things are going to happen. It's human nature, right? It's a setup from the start. It's entrapment to begin with. Any good lawyer would sit here and go, this is thrown out of court. This is entrapment. You're trying to entrap Jesus. You probably entrapped the poor woman who was just kind of under the influence. And so they bring this woman before them, before Jesus and all these other people, and say, now, you know what the law says? The law says stone her because she broke the law. And then Jesus says this famous line that how many of us have quoted from time to time? You remember? Jeez. Say it again. He who is without sin cast the first stone. I believe that's close to the King James Version, but that's essentially it, right? And how often do we find ourselves saying that when we find ourselves in these moments where somebody is trying to practice this practice of the shibboleth? They're trying to find some reason for sort of excluding someone else. They're putting a little judgment on someone else, and you think, well, yeah, but he who is without sin cast the first stone, right? The one without sin cast the first stone. We sort of use it as a get out of jail card almost. You know, we sort of use it almost cliche. And our temptation is to think that this story is about the stoners and the swingers and the practice of judgment. Judge not lest ye be judged. Ye yourself be judged, right? So it's all about judgment and judging others, right? Amen? Amen. Go home? See you later? No. It's not about any of those. Because when you start looking at the story, and you go back to here to see what they've been talking about this whole time, and you look at the history of the people with the covenant, and you remember that the covenant is about being a blessing, to be a blessing to the world, this has nothing to do with these particular specific things. It has something to do with all of it, but that's not the whole point of this story. The point of this story has to do with something else that we always forget, right? Something else that we go like, who knows what he was doing? Why did Jesus draw in the sand? The storyteller put it in there. John's gospel, by the way, is a unique kind of gospel, right? It's not like the other three gospels. This story is not in the other three gospels. John's gospel is written in the mid-2nd century, 120, 110, 130 AD. It's written long after, 70 years after some of the other gospels. It's not about the same thing. The storyteller in this gospel has a different way of thinking about Jesus. Why would he or she or they include this in the story? It's got to do with something, right? But I think the clue goes back to that text in Judges 17. And just so I can get it right, because I'm no longer using my notes, which is such a bad thing. Chapter 17, Jeremiah. It's not in Judges, see? It's such a bad thing. It's in Jeremiah. And of course it's in Jeremiah because Jeremiah was the prophet. And Jeremiah, like Jesus, is trying to get a point across, right? Jeremiah is a prophet, and so the people in Babylonian exile messed up. Now they're in exile. It's not about God coming through and saying, I'm going to go ahead and kill all your enemies and restore you back to your kingdom and your health and wealth. No, it's about you forgot why you're here. That's what the prophet does, comes through and tells us. Remember why we're here? We forget why we're here sometimes. I like to tell my drumming group sometimes when we're drumming in a circle and the circle gets out of rhythm, and I'll say, you forgot why you're here. And they go, no, I'm playing my drum. That's why I'm here. And I said, no. You're not here for your drum. You're here for their drum. We're here for each other's drums. The minute we start thinking about ourselves, which is number one problem of our existence, because it's human nature, the minute we start thinking about ourselves, it falls out of rhythm. And the same things happen in all of those stories in Judges. The same thing happens throughout the stories of the Bible. We forget the covenant. We think the covenant is about me and God. But the covenant is about me and everybody else. It's about us together in creation and God in the midst of that. So the prophet Jeremiah says this in chapter 17, verses 13, says, Lord, you are the hope of Israel. All who forsake you will be put to shame. Those who turn away from you will be written in the dust. because they have forgotten the spring of living water. What was Jesus doing? Well, you could say that he was saying, you people have screwed up again. You people, you Sadducees, you hypocrites, you judges, you've forgotten the whole thing. Your names are in sand. You're vanishing. You're worthless. But you see, Jesus said something about living water. What Paul later calls the ground of our being, this very source of life. Let's back up. What does research tell us is one of the things we long for that creates happiness? Right? We've talked about it in here before. Money? Acceptance. Let's take it a little further. Connection. We long for connection. They've done it in primate studies. They've done it with infants. And it's true for us as adults. We all long to be connected to someone else. If intimately, casually, in a group, it doesn't matter. We just long for connection. Some way of knowing we're a part of something and a part of someone else. Without that connection, which is where we find ourselves here, without that connection, we find ourselves kind of wandering in self-destructive patterns to where we do a couple of things. We go looking for love in all the wrong places. That's one thing we do. The other thing we do is we defend what we think we need but have not yet found, and we defend it to the teeth. We defend it with all of our judgment and violence and oppressiveness and anger and hatred and rules. We don't have it, but we think we might have it. And so we cling to whatever that is that we think we have. But this is what we're longing for. Jesus wasn't just writing in the sand for these Sadducees. Jesus was writing in the sand for that whole crowd gathered around, and for the woman caught in adultery. It's all like sand. Without that connection, it's all like sand. What all of us long for, what everyone longed for then, what God promised in these stories of the Bible is this idea that you will be connected, I will be with you, you will be with me, we will be connected. But how do you get there? Well, it would be nice if I said, all you got to do with living water, because I remember this when I was in the Baptist church, is all you got to do is receive Jesus into your heart. If you'll just close your eyes and don't raise your hand, just close your eyes with me and repeat this prayer after me, you will have this eternal life, right? All you have to do is have this ascension. Then what we're going to do is we're going to plug you into a I can't believe I'm saying this, a shibboleth group. We're going to plug you into a shibboleth group where you will know exactly what you're supposed to believe and what you're not supposed to believe, so that you'll know that you are secure in this connection to living water, except for one problem, right? It's not really connected. Because I'm telling you, if your faith is based on fear and defensiveness, it's not faith, right? It's fear and defensiveness. And that's where we are with a lot of our culture today, is living out of fear and not out of connection, not out of this living water metaphor. So how do we get there? Would you please show the first slide? I didn't get the, oops, you can't see the slide. I love this quote by Robert Thurman. Robert Thurman is a teacher of can't drive this thing. Robert Thurman is a teacher of Eastern Studies at Columbia University. I love this quote. When you understand the interconnectedness of things, yeah, you can just move it out to the side, thank you. When you understand the interconnectedness, it makes you more afraid of hating than of dying. If you really understand connectedness, it makes you more afraid. One of the things that I think we do pretty well here at First United Methodist Church is opportunities for connection. But more than that, opportunities to experiencing and expressing compassion. Next week, we're going to talk a little bit more about this, but I want to leave you with a couple of quick thoughts. Compassion is one major way, is one spiritual tool that we have for connecting with one another. But the problem with that is that we tend to wash it. We tend to kind of beat it up, misuse it, trivialize it, and use compassion to talk about so many things that are still fine. Kindness, gentleness, hospitality. Those are all still fine, but they kind of miss the point. You know, I did this. I carry around a pair of jumper cables with me. How many of you have jumper cables with you in your car? Wow, really? Where were you last week? So, no, it's not me. It's actually my son. But I carry one with me all the time, always have. But here's the funny thing is, I now carry it around all the time looking for batteries to jump. Only because, by coincidence, in the last couple of months, I've actually jumped about 8 cars. I pull into Home Depot. The guy like 3 cars over is sitting there, and I'm wondering, why is he sitting there? Well, he's just not asking. I guess he's waiting for someone to come along. Maybe he's going to call a friend, or somebody, but he's just sitting there with his windows down. I say, everything okay? He says, my car's dead. I got jumper cables, and I jumped the car. There was a guy stalled in front of our house 3 months ago, and he was in his car with a lot of junk that he picked up from the neighborhood and was taking it back to the other side. I think he was taking it over to the dump, and where you can get some cash for certain things, certain kinds of junk. And so he's just sitting there dark, and he and his mom are kind of having a little bit of an argument in there. It's like a little SUV, and I said, what's the problem? Car's dead. No problem. I got jumper cables. My kid started calling his dad, he started calling me the jumping wonder, because I just have jumper cables. You remember my uncle used to say to me when I would destroy things because I'd lose my temper, he would say, Tommy, if you look at life like a hammer, everything's going to start looking like a nail, right? So if I carry around jumper cables, everything's going to start looking like it needs a jump. Well, maybe, I don't know. But maybe if you think of life as being a blanket, everything's going to look like it needs covering. Or maybe if you think everything looks like a flower, you think everything's going to need watering. I'm not sure how far to take that metaphor, but I will say that when I got back in the car, the first things that I started doing, which I've had to discipline myself out of, was that after I would jump that cable, you might have experienced this sometime if you handed a sandwich over to somebody on the corner, or if you've done something else when you pass somebody by, just a nice gesture. You might have gotten back in your car, and when I got back in my car, I said to Linda at one time when she was beside me, I said, well, I guess I've... See how ingrained it is? See how entrenched we are in these patterns? I guess I've done my good deed for the day, right? But Jesus said, love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul. Love your neighbor as yourself. It's not a one-time, it's not a one-day thing. It's sort of like a day-to-day way of life. It's a moment-to-moment way of life. That's connection. Connection isn't a one-time thing. It really isn't like I just take my jumper cables out and go, now I'm going to connect to the interconnectedness of all things. Now I'm going to disconnect and go back to my own little private world because I like it there. In reality, we're called to be a part. We're invited to be a part of this living water all the time in all of our encounters. And what's required is this word compassion. So I'm kidnapping it from gentleness, hospitality, and goodness. And pull up this wonderful website that we have, if you can. The next quote real quick. That's the link. Do you have the page? No, don't have the page. I thought we would get the page up there. Can't. Okay, never mind. That was the link. I thought it would have up the page. Sharm, do you recognize that link? Sharm is our director of Compassion and Justice Ministries. Now, you won't have time to do it right now. Go home and do it. Compassion and Justice Ministries, if you look at that page, it's amazing how much we do in the community, how much we do for one another, how many opportunities, not just Costa Rica or Kenya, how many opportunities we have day to day just through this church to be in ministry, in compassionate ministries. What's the quote that you have on there when you say compassion is?
There are a lot of problems in the world and a lot of people working on them.
And then at the top, do you remember what it says? Compassion, someone's drowning.
Yeah, you probably better say it.
See, that's why I wished it was up there. Compassion is when someone's drowning, you jump in and save them. Justice is you swim up the stream to help prevent people from jumping in or drowning, right? Which I thought was a great definition. But I'm going to take it one step further and say compassion is connecting. That if you look at the root words of compassion, passion, it means to take interest. Passion, to connect, to be with, to take interest in. What is it that you're passionate about? You're interested in it, right? To be with passion in the world is to take notice. And when we begin to take notice, something starts to happen. Other people begin to notice, because we're all basically compassionate at heart, but we're distracted. But when one begins to notice, others begin to notice. And as we begin to notice, we begin to do something. We begin to feed off of this living water, this interconnectedness of things. And we begin to be what? Band, y'all come on up. I forgot to give you your cue to come on up. But we forget that when we do this, we are connecting to that covenant. We are opening up to that covenant relationship that we are part of from the very beginning. The interconnectedness of all things. But here's what happens. You don't go to hell. You're not going to burn if you're not compassionate. That's not the problem. The problem is we're just going to be like sand blowing in the wind.